I'm building a breakfast room table and I have a serious time crunch. On Saturday, me and the family are taking a little vacation. So let's see if I can squeeze this one into the cracks and knock it out before I head to the beach. The first thing I want to do is pick out the boards that I want to use for the top of the table, because I want my nicest pieces to be used to make the tabletop, because that's what you'll be looking at the most. As I go along cutting up all these boards, I do my best to label them so that way I can keep track of them easily, so that way I don't end up grabbing a piece for the base when I really needed something for the top. Next up is to head over to the joiner and just clean up one face on each one of these boards. Now you see I have them stacked up kind of like Lincoln logs, and that is intentional to let air flow around the boards. That way they can move, bow, twist, whatever they're gonna do overnight. I'm gonna let them rest until roughly tomorrow afternoon. So I'm gonna call it a night. These guys are gonna chill out and I'll be back at it tomorrow. All right, it is a new day. These boards have rested overnight and now I'm ready to bring them down to their final thickness here at the planer. Before I start joining the first edge of my boards, I make sure that the fence is square. And then I set up this mag switch featherboard to keep my boards pressed against the fence on my joiner. And what this is going to do is to help make sure that the edge I create is 90 degrees to the flat surface on my boards. There are a couple of products from MagSwitch that I use pretty regularly in the shop, and if you're interested in this or any of their other accessories, you can use my code WoodshopMike at checkout and save 10%. So hope that helps. Next up, we're going to be over at the table saw, and I'm going to rip the opposite side of these boards parallel with that surface that we just established on the joiner. With all of the pieces milled for the top, I have them laid out on my bench. Alternating the grain pattern in each one of the boards helps to keep the top flat over time. So I'm going to do this, I'm going to domino it, and then I'm also going to add some C-channel. That's going to help me make sure that this table stays as flat as possible. Laying out the dominoes on a square or rectangular table is pretty easy, but when it comes to laying them out for a round table, you got to make sure that you're not going to cut through one when you cut the tabletop round. Because Lord knows, every time you have friends or family over for dinner, there's going to be that one guy that's going to pick on you for cutting through the domino. When I cut dominoes for panel glue ups or just about anything, I cut one side of the joint on the loose setting and the other side of the joint on the tight setting. Now the dominoes that I'm using for this tabletop are 12mm by 140mm long. Adding dominoes to a tabletop doesn't just make it more resilient and less likely to warp over time, but it also makes gluing all these boards together a lot easier because I'm not worried about them shifting out of place while I'm putting the thing in clamps. So with dominoes cut in all the pieces, I just need to fill my glue bottle up. So the sequence that I follow is to put a little bit of glue in those tight mortises and then hammer the domino in. And I do this for all the boards that I'm going to be gluing up at any one time. And then I apply a layer of glue to the edge of the board that I'm getting ready to glue together, along with a little bit of glue on the exposed domino. I do that as I'm putting the boards together rather than all at once, so that way the glue doesn't tack and produce a poor glue joint. For a panel this size, 3 of the K-body revos is all I need for adequate clamping pressure. And since I don't have dominoes at the very end of each one of these boards, there might be a little bit of misalignment. So I throw a bar clamp in those areas to bring the boards flush with one another. I am ready to get this tabletop glued together, but first, something's missing. Coffee. Since gluing up the rest of this tabletop is pretty much the same song second verse, I'm going to tell you about something you may not know about, and that is Jackson Family Coffee Company. So first off, the Jackson family is a friend of mine, great family, great folks. They're a homesteading family, and they roast their coffee beans in a wood-fired roaster. I am not kidding when I say it is the best coffee I have ever had. So if you're anything like me and you love a good cup of coffee, you can use my code WSM10 at checkout to save 10% off your order. So this is going to be the base for the table, and the center is going to get cut to a nice circle, so don't worry, it's not going to look all like it currently does. And I'm making sure that when that circle is cut out, that I'm not going to have any dominoes showing up, because there again, I don't want to have that guy that's picking on me. So every now and then, while things are just trucking along smoothly, throwing those dominoes in, you have one that's just a little bit stubborn for some reason. I have no idea what was going on with this one, but it is clearly not going anywhere. So since I had some glue waiting on me in that other mortise, I go ahead and throw in that first domino, and yeah, the saw is coming out. We're just gonna chop that one off, cut a new mortise, and see if we don't have better luck next time. That's much better. While I was laying out for the location of all of my dominoes, I made sure to draw a couple of reference lines so that way I could put these pieces together accurately, and also once it's in clamps, I can scooch the pieces left or right or whatever and make sure that everything is lined up exactly like I need it to be. Whenever possible, one thing I like to do is to work off of these Bora Centipede work stands. Being able to get to all sides of a project, or in this case a tabletop, makes things go so much easier. Before I move on with any sanding or additional operations, I go ahead and fill all of the voids with CA glue. In this case, I'm going with black medium thick Star Bond. So my goal for the day is to get the underside of the tabletop sanded, and then also to get the pieces for the base. I'm looking because that's where the base is. You can't see it, but I can. Also to get the base cut out on the CNC and have it at least ready to sand tomorrow, and keep on keeping on. You've almost certainly seen this trick before, but the best way I've found to keep track of where you've sanded and where you need to keep working is to scribble all over the surface you're working on with a pencil. So just embrace your inner toddler and go to town, because really it's the only time you're allowed to draw on furniture. So I'm ready to cut the base pieces to size. I don't have a bit that's long enough to cut all the way through the material, so I'm going to cut 1 inch down, and then I'm going to clean up the rest with a hand router and a pattern bit. But I need to secure this material to my CNC. So what I end up using a lot is blue painter's tape and CA glue. And hopefully this piece won't move once the CNC starts cutting on it. So keep our fingers crossed and see what happens. Now make sure everything is lined up before I finally press it into place, because once it is down, it has got a tenacious grip. We are coming up on the moment of truth, because I've never used blue painter's tape to hold a piece like this on the CNC, and just a little bit nervous to see how it all turns out. Well, apparently I had nothing to be nervous about, and good grief, that thing is on there good. Maybe I can go with a little bit less next time. I don't know if it's just my jigsaw or if this is pretty common, but the blade on mine always drifts like crazy. It doesn't matter if it's a new blade or an old blade. So I cut a really wide margin, because the last thing I want is to put a nice gouge in the side of this piece. You know, I was thinking about hanging the cutoff from the inside of this leg up on the wall upstairs as a modern art piece, but unfortunately, it broke. To transfer the profile cut on the CNC to the rest of this piece, I'm using a helical upcut pattern bit in my router. And the reason I'm using this instead of just a straight bit in my router is, for starters, they're just more comfortable to use. You get less chatter, especially while you're hand routing, which just overall makes the process a little bit more enjoyable and less nerve-wracking. And the second reason is that the surface finish is just going to be so much better, which in turn means less sanding, and I know we all love that. To make things just a little bit easier, I only flush trimmed 2 of those outside edges, and then I trimmed up the rest of it on the table saw. The best way I know of to clean up the inside surface, other than having someone else sand it, is with one of these drill mounted drum sanders. Now what's nice about this is you can put just a scrap piece of sandpaper in there, lock it in place, and go to town. You don't have to buy individual sanding drums, which are pretty expensive. With the inside of both of these pieces sanded, I take one of them and I cut it in half, or almost in half, over here on the table saw. And before any of you start leaving comments about, oh hey Mike, you cut through a domino, I meant to cut through this one, so I don't want to hear it. So what I'm doing here is I'm cutting out essentially a notch from the center of this piece from the base. That way, when the three pieces are glued back together, everything is the same width. If that doesn't make sense, then hopefully it does here in a little while. All right, y'all, so the base pieces have been cut out and sanded to 60 grit. The inside has already been finished sanded to 120 grit, and what I'm getting ready to do now is to locate and cut dominoes so that way I can put the two half pieces and the larger main piece together. I don't remember how long I'd had my domino joiner for before I saw somebody do this to make setting up the location of the domino so much easier. Just take the front thing off of the back thing so it's so much lighter. It makes perfect sense. Once I establish where this mortise needs to be cut, I set up a square to help also align this straight edge. And as you see, I'm setting up to do that blue painter's tape and CA trick again, but this time I'm using it to hold my straight edge in place. I'm going to use that as a reference for my domino joiner. So a little bit of double checking, and then I'm just pressing it and holding it still for a couple of seconds while the glue activates. The last thing to do is to check for square real quick to make sure that this straight edge is right where it needs to be. One thing that I really like about having a metal straight edge like this is it's super easy to mark layout lines on. So that way, for these kinds of operations, I have a really clear indication of exactly where I need to cut that slot. With the mortises cut in the main portion of the base, I now cut the corresponding mortises in these half pieces of the base. I didn't show this on camera, but I did sand down these dominoes just a little bit because I didn't want the fit to be too tight and risk potentially splitting this piece there at the very ends where the wood is kind of thin. So for this, I'm just using one domino and I more or less center it in the slots that I've cut. And then I slide on one side, which was pretty painless, and then I flip it around and just repeat the process. While I knock out the last glue up for this project, I want to give a huge thank you and shout out to this project sponsor. Bessie Clamps has been an integral part of my shop now for the last several years, and without their phenomenal products and variety of products, I couldn't tackle the projects that I do with the same level of accuracy. So thank you so much to Bessie for sponsoring this build, and if you haven't tried out their clamps, you really don't know what you're missing out on. You gotta check them out. One thing that I had to do by hand was blending where these three pieces come together at the bottom and top of the table base. But it was quick work for my 5-inch random orbit sander and a little bit of 80 grit sandpaper. I just worked up through the grits, and once it was all done, this section was nice and smooth and you couldn't even feel where the pieces met. You probably just about forgot that we needed to finish cutting this tabletop round before we can call this project done. So I find the center location, don't worry, this is the bottom of the tabletop, and I drill for a pinhole for my circle cutting jig. I only double check this measurement about 20 times because the worst thing right now would be to cut this just a little bit too small. I add a stack of pulleys there to the center to keep my jig from accidentally popping up out of that center hole. So aside from just walking in circles, what I'm doing is dragging my router bit along the edge of this tabletop, and I'm doing that so that I can see where my cut is going to be. So I just mark it with pencil real quick so I can see it a little bit better. So once all of that is checked out and things are looking good, I start cutting the tabletop out. Now you may notice that I'm only cutting one half of the tabletop at a time, and the simple reason I did that is to keep the hose and cord from getting all twisted up and tangled. Here again, the bit that I'm using is not long enough to go all the way through, so I'm going to cut just past halfway, and then I'll use the jigsaw and router to clean things up like I did previously. So during the course of working on this table, the Triton 3¼ horsepower came in, and oh my goodness, this thing is a beast. Now don't get me wrong, I love my DeWalt router, but this one from Triton has got so much power it didn't even slow down while I was cutting the edge of this tabletop flush. Once the tabletop is cut round, I reuse that pinhole that I drilled earlier to lay out some lines that will help me locate the base exactly where it needs to go. In this video, I don't show how I connect the mounting plates to the base because I covered that in a previous table build, and you can check it out in the card above right now. Those details are also laid out in the build plans on my website that'll take out all the guesswork and make building this table for yourself a lot easier. Once I have the location of all these mounting plates figured out, I go ahead and drill a series of holes with a Forstner bit, and that's going to give my mounting screws some clearance. Then I tape a template to the underside of the table, and I use that as a guide to route out a pocket for these mounting plates to sit into. I'm using two routers here with two different bits set up in them, and the reason is just because I want the corners and the pockets that I cut to have as small of a radius as possible. Before I remove my router template, I want to do a quick test fit and make sure that this mounting plate is going to sit flush with the underside of the table. As you can see, it's kind of tricky to pull that out with my fingers, but it's nothing that this little guy from MagSwitch can't help me take care of. So you remember those two holes I drilled earlier with the Forstner bit? Well, this is what they're for. They allow for the head of the two screws that hold this mounting plate to the base to fit inside of the tabletop without colliding, so that way that mounting plate can sit flush. Whenever possible, I cut for my C-channel on the CNC, but when tables are too big, this is the route that I have to go. So when I figure out exactly where the C-channel needs to be on this table, I set up my straight edge and use it to help me locate my C-channel routing template. A C-channel routing template that's similar to this one is going to be available on Bidwell's website here before too much longer, and you can still use my discount code to save some money off of that purchase. The first cut that I make is to clear out a slot for both of the legs on the C-channel, and at this point, if I really wanted to, I could go ahead and install it as is. The only trouble is that it's not going to sit flush with the underside of the top, which is not what I want. So you probably noticed that I set my straight edge back against the template before I removed it, and that's so that I could put this jig in place. Once I get this next jig in place, what I'll be able to do is to clear out the material between those two 1/4-inch slots that I routed earlier, and this will allow that C-channel to sit flush with the underside of the table. I just route a small section and check my depth with a ruler, because if I cut this area too deep, I'm going to have to go back and cut those original slots a little bit deeper as well. Once everything is cut for both pieces of C-channel, I grab the table base and bring it back over, and I set it in place. And using a punch, I transfer the location for all of the remaining mounting holes so that way the base can be attached to the tabletop. I then do the same thing for both pieces of C-channel. I get the C-channel centered in the slot, and using a punch, I locate where every bolt or every threaded insert actually needs to be located. I wrap a little piece of tape around the drill bit I'm using so that way I don't drill too deep and accidentally go through the top of the table. I also chamfer the top of all the holes so that way it makes running in those threaded inserts just a little bit easier. With all the routing and whatnot done for the bottom of the tabletop, it's now time to prep this surface for finish. So for this project, I'll sand up to 120 grit, brand the underside, sand it back just a little bit, and then I'm ready for finish on the bottom. My finish of choice for this project is Rubio Monocoat in the color Charcoal, and the rest of the table we're going to do something a little bit different, but for the bottom I'm just going with straight Rubio Monocoat and only working in sections that are small enough for me to apply and rub back the excess before the finish starts to cure. One thing to keep in mind when you're installing C-channel is that you want the majority of the screws to just be snug enough to hold it in place and only have the center 3 or so screws tightened down where it's pretty snug, so that way the wood can still expand and contract throughout the seasons. So I said I was doing something just a little bit different regarding the finish for the rest of this table, and it's just that I'm first applying Rubio Monocoat's Precolor Easy in black. There are a few things to keep in mind with Precolor Easy, and the first one is that it's a water-based product, so you want to make sure you keep a wet edge as you're working in sections, otherwise you're probably going to end up with a lap line. The other thing, as you know, water raises the grain on wood, so just keep an eye on that and be ready to knock back any raised grain if you need to. So after the Precolor Easy is sufficiently dry, I go back with the Rubio Monocoat Charcoal 2C oil that I used on just the underside of the tabletop to really finish things out. I really like the color that comes out of this finishing process by combining the Precolor Easy Black along with the Rubio Monocoat Charcoal. I really like how the finish came together on this table. I just think the black Precolor Easy along with the charcoal oil makes for a great combination and a color that's hard to beat. It's not just black, it's black with a little bit of charcoal and a little bit of gray and a little bit of graphite. And it's got just that subtle satin sheen to it to make it look amazing. Somehow I finished up this table before we left for vacation, which is awesome. Now, I'm not gonna lie, there were a couple of very late nights and I didn't do some of those nightly recaps that I had been doing because my shop is in the basement, so I didn't want them to go, why is Dad talking? And goodness, what time is it? Anyways, if you are interested in plans for this table, they are linked in the description below. And if you want to see some of my other woodworking videos, you can check them out in a playlist right here. Until next time, let the sawdust fly and have fun making something.